Okay, here we are again in my favorite reading nook. Do you have a favorite reading nook that you like to go to? A place that's quiet? Favorite place to read? This is my son's old bedroom. It's got the paneling. There's two rooms in this house that have the paneling. I'm not fond of it, but it is what it is for now. Chapter 2, Race for the Record. The Gum Gatherers. 7 years later, 1949, Palawan Island. Alistair Sutherland unbuttoned his shirt collar and slumped against the plain wooden pew of the little chapel in Brooks Point. At 11 years of age, he was expected to sit through his father's sermons without wiggling, but it was so hot. The air seemed trapped inside the whitewashed wooden chapel, without even a sea breeze passing through the open windows to nudge it. April and May were the hottest months in the Philippine Islands, hot and dry. At least school was out until June. That's when the monsoon rains started. School. Alistair silently groaned. He was tired of going to the little Christian school here in Brooks Point. The school didn't even have a building. It met in the chapel. Only two teachers, and one was Alistair's own mother. He wanted to go to the boarding school in Manila with the children of other missionaries, but no, his parents said he had to wait until he was 12 years old, which meant he had to wait another whole year. Alistair sighed. At least his parents had said he was old enough to go along with his father and Mr. Edwards on Mr. Edwards's next trading trip into the mountains, and they were going tomorrow. He glanced across the aisle at the gray-haired American businessman sitting with his sweet Filipino wife. The Edwards' son, Bertie, used to go with his father on these trips into the mountains of Palawan Island, but that was before Bertie died of blackwater fever during the war. Bertie Edwards. Alistair could hardly remember the young man who used to be like a big brother to him and his little sister Heather. In fact, he could hardly remember the 2 years his family and the Edwards' family spent hiding in the mountains. But he did remember the American submarine that had rescued them from the island when he was 6 years old. The U.S. Navy had taken them to a hospital in Australia to recover from their ordeal. When the war was over a few months later, though, the Sutherlands had come right back to Palawan Island to continue their missionary work. How glad they were when Mr. and Mrs. Edwards returned safely home to Brooks Point, too. Even though Harry Edwards' storage sheds and trade goods had been destroyed during the war, he started over, building up his export business. But soon, he was once again taking trips up the mountain trails to trade for the gum resin, beeswax, and rattan reeds that the Palawan's tradespeople collected from the forest. These raw materials could be sold in the cities, where they were made into all sorts of useful things like paint and plastic and polish and furniture. Sometimes Alistair's father, Sandy Sutherland, went along with Harry Edwards on these trips, hoping to make contact with some of the tradespeople to tell them about Jesus. But most of them spoke only Palawano. Only a few knew Tagalog, the trade language of the Philippines that Mr. Edwards had learned. Alistair had always liked to hear stories about these trips. Mr. Edwards told him about the gum gatherers, young men and boys who climbed the towering Almaciga palms to collect the gum resin. I apologize if I don't say that right. They scurried up ropes of twisted vines like circus acrobats. But now Alistair would get to see these daredevils for himself if he didn't suffocate from heat right here in the pew first. Alistair eyed the pulpit. How long was his father going to preach? He wished he had a fan. Then he noticed a Sunday school paper sticking out of the Bible on his mother's lap, just right for making a paper fan. He looked at her sideways, wondering if she'd mind if he used it. But Macy Sutherland was busy trying to corral his two wiggly brothers Glenn and Craigie. His sister, 9-year-old Heather, sat as far away at the end of the pew as she could get. Carefully, Alistair pinched a corner of the Sunday school paper and pulled it slowly out of his mother's Bible. Success! She hadn't noticed. He opened the paper to make a bigger fan and began to fold it, accordion like. But some words in the big type on the inside page caught his eye. Missionary takes gospel records to primitive tribes. Alistair stopped folding. Gospel records? Wasn't that what his father and Mr. Edwards talked about sometimes? They said it had been Bertie Edwards' idea, making records in the Pawano language so even people who couldn't read could hear stories about Jesus. Now, here was somebody who was doing that very thing. Just when Alistair's father announced the hymn, finally, when the service was over, Alistair quickly slipped off the wooden bench and ran outside. People were starting to walk or ride their bicycles down the lane between the rows of neat bamboo houses perched on 6-foot stilts. Bushes, lush with purple and red bougainvillea flowers, ran riot between the thatched hoof houses. Alistair looked this way and that. Had he missed Mr. Edwards already? Then he saw him and his wife walking down the lane. Mr. Edwards, he cried, running after them. Look at this. As the other couple turned, the sandy-haired boy shoved the Sunday school paper into the older man's hand. What is it, son? Said Harry Edwards. As he quickly scanned the story, a boyish grin spread across his face. Without another word, the tall American, still spry at age 70, sprinted back toward the chapel with Alistair in hot pursuit. Sandy Sutherland had finished shaking hands with people as they came out of the chapel and was shutting the doors when Harry Edwards and Alistair found him. Look here, Sandy, Harry Edwards said, waving the Sunday school paper in the pastor's face. Someone else has had the same idea Bernie did, and is actually doing it. Sandy Sutherland scanned the story. Joy Ritterhoff. Started her AIM mission called Gospel Recordings. Look, says here that she's made recordings of primitive languages in Honduras and Mexico and Alaska. And now those isolated people have the gospel on records. Amazing! He looked up from the paper. I wonder, do you think gospel recordings would send someone here? Harry Edwards slapped his friend on the shoulder. That's what we're going to ask them. He laughed. I'll write Miss Ritterhoff today. Wouldn't it be fantastic if someone from the gospel recordings would come back to Brooks Point? Though how we'd get their recording equipment up the mountain, I can't even begin to imagine. Alistair, who was following the two men as they talked, silently agreed. He knew his father and Mr. Edwards were excited about this record idea, but it did seem slightly crazy. After all, most of the mountain tribes didn't let strangers come into their barrios. He'd heard that often enough. They were afraid of the strange sicknesses that foreigners brought with them. Tomorrow, for instance, they would hike up the trail to a trading post where the forest people were willing to meet to trade their goods. But if they tried to go to their village uninvited, they might get shot with blowguns. Besides, he snorted to himself, how would the mountain people play the records? They didn't even have electricity. Good question. A thin ribbon of gray light was just beginning to separate the horizon into sea and sky when Alistair's father shook his shoulder the next morning. Time to get up, lad. Make it quick. We don't want to keep Mr. Edwards waiting. Alistair opened one eye. Why was his father waking him up so early? The sun wasn't even up yet. Then he remembered. Today was the day he was going on a trading trip up the mountains. By the time Alistair and his father got down to the beach where Mr. Edwards's crew was loading a jeepney with metal pots, bolts of cloth, and sacks of salt and rice, the rising sun was cutting a blazing path across the Sulu sea. The sky was cloudless. Tall coconut palms lining the pearl white beach waved their long frowns like a welcome in the early morning breeze. "Swing on board," called Mr. Edwards, hopping into the driver's seat of the jeepney. "We'll drive this stuff as far as the trailhead, then we'll hike it up the rest of the way." An hour later, the trading party was well on their way up the mountain trail. 10 strong, wiry porters, Filipinos employed by Mr. Edwards, carried the goods for trading on their shoulders or backs. Alistair scrambled up the rocky path, trying to keep up. The forest was so thick with ivy, ferns, and walls of morning glory leaves that the light filtering through the tree tops was dim and gloomy. The hikers stopped mid-morning to drink from their canteens and rest for 15 minutes. "How do you think this Joy Ritterhoff does it?" Alistair heard his father say to Harry Edwards as they munched on the nuts and dried fruit Maisie Sutherland had packed for them. "I mean, we'd have to find someone who could translate from English to Tagalog, and then someone else who could translate Tagalog into Palawano. And even then, how would we know the translation wasn't all mixed up?" All good questions. Mr. Edwards chuckled. "You're the preacher, Sutherland. I'm the one who should be asking the Doubting Thomas questions." Sandy Sutherland laughed. "You're right," he said, rolling his R's in his soft Scottish accent. "I should have more faith. Finding that story about gospel recordings wasn't a coincidence, was it? More like a miracle, eh?" Alistair sighed. His father and Mr. Edwards were acting like that Joy lady was coming next week. The letter wouldn't even go out until the next steamer came to Brooks Point. And even when she got the letter, she might not be able to send anyone to the Philippines. It was a long shot for sure. It was almost noon when the trading party came to a fork in the trail. "Unload here," Mr. Edwards called to the porters. He waved a hand at a small area that had been cleared of brush and vines. "But there's no one here," said Alistair, looking around in disappointment. He had hoped to see some of the mountain people. "They know we're here. Just wait," said his father quietly. They waited. The men mopped their necks with big bandanas. Insects whined. Bored, Alistair watched a bright yellow and black butterfly rest on a cluster of orchids that wrapped like a collar around a trunk tree. A tree trunk. Then it flitted away. As Alistair followed it with his eyes, he saw a small man standing stock still in the middle of the trail, just above them. He was naked except for a loincloth of bark around his waist. His long black hair was bundled up on the back of his head. "Papa," he whispered loudly. How long had the man been there? "Oppo." "Hello," said Mr. Edwards, getting to his feet. "Oppo," said the man, suddenly smiling, showing a row of teeth darkened by betel nut juice. He spit, then smiled again. Mr. Edwards motioned to his foreman, Jose, who was fluent in Tagalog, to help him talk to the man. The tall American seemed to tower over the short tribesman, who gestured up one fork of the trail. After a few brief exchanges in Tagalog and Palawano, Jose said, "He wants us to follow him to where they're gathering the Almaquiga gum. Almaquiga gum. We can trade there." The trail now seemed steeper and harder. Sometimes Alistair couldn't even see that there was a trail, but he doggedly followed his father's back through the huge elephant leaves and vines. Soon they heard voices chattering to one another. The voices seemed nearby, but Alistair couldn't see anyone. Then a movement caught his eye in the palm trees towering above him. He tipped his head back and looked up. Rattan vines had been strung at a steep angle between several trees, anchored low on one tree, then tied halfway up a second tall palm. Another vine then went back higher now, to the first tree, while still another vine strung up toward a third tree. Young men and boys were climbing up these taut, slanted vines, pulling themselves hand over hand while their feet ran up the vines like tightrope walkers. Now, everywhere Alistair looked, he saw limber young boys and men climbing the tall vines into the towering palms. They called back and forth to each other, laughing, filling slings that they wore over their shoulders with the precious gummy resin. "Apo, apo," they called down to the trading party on the ground, and then they laughed. By now, the posters in the trading party, excuse me, by now the porters in the trading party had put down the sacks they had carried up the mountainside. They unloaded some of the items, then refilled the sacks with raw almaquiga gum. Alistair sat on a rock out of the way, watching all the activity. 10 yards away, he noticed a slender boy, maybe 15 years old, arguing with a man. The boy kept pointing at a piece of carved bone that hung on a leather string around the man's neck, then pointing to himself. The man shook his head and gestured angrily up into the trees, protesting. The boy grabbed the leather string, but the man hit his hand away. Alistair looked questioningly at Mr. Edwards. "What's happening?" Harry Edwards watched the tussle for a moment. "Looks like the boy wants the man's necklace. Probably a good luck charm of some kind." "But why?" asked Alistair. "I'm not sure," said Mr. Edwards, "but the Palawans are very afraid of evil spirits. They have all sorts of rituals and chants and charms to protect themselves." Finally, the man grabbed the boy's arm and again pointed up into the trees, jerking his arm away. The Palawano's boy angrily shouted something and scurried like a monkey up one of the rattan vines. The man stalked away. Alistair's stomach growled. Come to think of it, he hadn't had anything to eat since they stopped to rest at mid-morning. It must be afternoon by now. He knew his mother had packed some food for him and his father. He rummaged in a pack. Where was that food? A scream made him jump. Jerking his head, Alistair saw the boy who had been arguing with his father? Falling from the tree he'd been climbing. The boy grabbed frantically at some loose vines, but they pulled away in his hand. He dropped like a stone, landing in a bushy thicket with a sickening thud. Oh my goodness. I hope he's going to be okay.